Howdy folks, in today's English video lesson, we're going to learn some vocabulary with Annaka Harris. Please check out the description because I'll put more example sentences in the description for you to read. All right, let's do this.
I think that we don't actually have any evidence that consciousness is complex, that it comes out of complex processing, that it's required for complex processing. And I think we've made this anthropomorphic mistake.
The first word of the lesson is anthropomorphic. This describes an attribute, a quality, a characteristic that is given to a non-human entity but belongs to humans. For instance, in children's books, we often come across animals that talk just like we do. We know that animals don't use English, for instance, to communicate. So this is an anthropomorphic characteristic. Anthropomorphic. The pronunciation is a little tricky, so let's go back and hear it again.
Complex, that it comes out of complex processing, that it's required for complex processing. And I think we've made this anthropomorphic mistake because we are conscious, and it's very hard to get evidence. It's one of the things that makes consciousness unique and mysterious, and why I'm fascinated with it is it's the one thing in nature that we can't get conclusive evidence of from the outside.
Conclusive is the second word of the lesson. It describes evidence that settles a matter. So currently, there are lots of questions, but once we find conclusive evidence, those questions are finally answered. You must be familiar with the word conclusion. Conclusive is the adjective. Pay attention to the pronunciation of this word. There's a sound, so conclusive.
By analogy, you're behaving basically the same way I behave, more or less. You talk about your conscious experiences, and therefore I just extrapolate from that you're having a felt experience in the way I am.
Okay, let's talk about the verb extrapolate. It's a fantastic word to learn. When we extrapolate data, we connect the dots. We don't have direct evidence, but we can figure out how something works, or whether in this case someone is conscious or not based on their behavior. So humans talk, they communicate their feelings, and we can come to the conclusion indirectly that they are conscious, just like we are.
And we can do that throughout nature. Well, there's no physical evidence. There's nothing we can observe from the outside that will give us conclusive proof that consciousness is there. And so I think we've made this leap to, because we're conscious and because we're unique and special.
When you make a leap, you can imagine what this means. You kind of jump to a conclusion, even though there is not solid evidence to support that conclusion.
And complex and intelligent in the way that we are. And because we don't have an intuition that anything else is conscious, or we have no feedback about it.
We don't get any feedback from inanimate objects. So for instance, rocks don't talk. They don't express their feelings, obviously. So how would we know if a rock were conscious or not?
We've made this assumption that consciousness, that those things aren't conscious, and felt experience does not exist out there in other atoms and forms of life even, but especially not inanimate objects.
Yeah, she uses the word inanimate, which is the one that I used as well. Inanimate describes a particular entity, for instance, objects that don't apparently have feelings, or they don't behave like other animals. They don't talk, they don't eat, they don't experience feelings, apparently.
And therefore, consciousness is somehow tied to these other things that make us unique. That consciousness arises when there is this complex processing.
So she's calling into question this assumption, right? She is casting doubt on this assumption that conscious beings should manifest some sort of human-like trait. She's calling this into question. She is asserting that this is probably not true.
When there is, and we can talk about the evolution argument too, which I think is super interesting to get into, and I'm hoping to talk to Richard Dawkins about this for my series.
What do you think about consciousness?
He's not interested. He's not interested. And actually, the conversation I would have with him would be very brief because he's just not that interested in this topic. But let's go back to the Richard Dawkins piece because I feel like there's a lot to talk about here in terms of our intuitions about consciousness, what it's doing, why in my book and everywhere I talk about consciousness, I bring it back to these two questions that I think are at the heart of our intuitions about consciousness. And so your questions about whether human beings are unique and special and all of that, I think are interesting questions and something we could talk about. I see them as separate questions from the consciousness questions.
So you see consciousness as giving a felt experience to our uniqueness as opposed to the
A felt experience is one where someone actually has firsthand subjective experience. So felt in this context means subjective experience, firsthand experience.
uniqueness giving birth to consciousness.
Yes, and that potentially there is felt experience, even though it sounds crazy even to me, that there is felt experience in all matter. And at this point in my thinking, and after a few conversations with some physicists, I think if consciousness is fundamental, the only thing that actually makes sense is that it is part of the most fundamental, that space-time and everything else emerges out of.
Out of consciousness.
Felt
Okay, so this is her assertion. She believes that consciousness is the bedrock of existence that is woven into the fabric of the universe. As always, I encourage you to think critically, but I also hope that you've learned at least one word with my video lesson. Catch you in the next.